The Ghost Soldiers Rescue. Raid at Cabanatuan. January 30, 1945. 1940 hours. Cabanatuan, Philippines. Captain Robert Prince lay in the tall grass 800 yards from the prison camp fence, his heart hammering against Philippine soil. Through field glasses, he could see skeletal figures moving behind barbed wire, American soldiers who had become ghosts, men the world had forgotten, men who had survived 3 years of hell that had killed 2/3 of their comrades. Prince checked his watch. 45 seconds until the P-61 Black Widow would make its pass. 60 seconds until 121 Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and 200 Filipino guerrillas would launch the most audacious prisoner of war rescue in American military history. Behind him, spread across a mile of open terrain, offering no more cover than a billiard table, lay his assault force. Every man knew the mathematics of their situation. Over 100 Rangers and Scouts and 200 guerrillas had traveled 30 miles behind Japanese lines to reach the camp. Intelligence reported approximately 300 Japanese soldiers inside the compound, 1,000 more across the Kabu River, and potentially 5,000 within striking distance in Cabanatuan City. The mission was simple, impossible, and absolutely necessary. Penetrate deep into enemy territory, assault a fortified prison camp, liberate over 500 dying men, and bring them all home. Every single one, no one left behind. This is the story of the Cabanatuan Raid, the Great Raid, where determination confronted desperate odds, where Rangers became legends, and where American soldiers proved that no matter how far behind enemy lines, no matter how impossible the mission, they would never abandon their brothers. The Death March survivors. The men imprisoned at Cabanatuan were the remnants of America's most catastrophic military defeat. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they simultaneously launched invasions across the Pacific. Despite insufficient supplies, American and Filipino troops were able to fight for 3 months on the Bataan Peninsula, holding out far longer than anyone thought possible. By the time the Filipinos and the US troops finally surrendered on April 9, 1942, the Philippine Scouts were in a very bad position. The battle had become a nightmare of starvation and disease. By the 1st of April 1942, most of the starving men had lost as much as 30% of their body weight, and they became so weak that they could barely lift their weapons. General Edward P. King, the American field commander, surrendered rather than see any more of his starving, diseased men slaughtered by the advancing Japanese army. King went against his superiors' orders, accepting personal responsibility for approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops. What followed became one of warfare's darkest chapters. The prisoners were force-marched north to San Fernando and then taken by rail in cramped and unsanitary boxcars farther north to Capus. From there they walked an additional 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell. The march covered approximately 65 miles under conditions designed to kill. During the main march, which lasted 5 to 10 days, depending on where a prisoner joined it, the captives were beaten, shot, bayoneted, and in many cases beheaded. Men marched without food or water in tropical heat exceeding 100 degrees. Those who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Those who stopped for water were shot. Those who helped comrades were killed alongside them. Only 54,000 prisoners reached the camp. Some 2,500 Filipinos and 500 Americans may have died during the march, and an additional 26,000 Filipinos and 1,500 Americans died at Camp O'Donnell. Private Leon Beck, who survived the march, later described the horror. You'd see a man fall and you'd keep walking. You couldn't help. If you stopped, you died with him. I watched friends collapse and I kept walking. That's what the Death March did. It made you choose between humanity and survival. Most of us chose survival and hated ourselves for it. Camp O'Donnell was a former Philippine army camp designed to accommodate about 10,000 men. The Japanese crammed 60,000 survivors of the Death March into the camp. The conditions defied imagination. There was little running water, sparse food, no medical care, and nothing but narrow trenches along the sides of the camp for sanitation. The heat was intolerable. Flies rose out of the latrines and covered the prisoners' food. They began to die at the rate of 400 per day. By August 1942, the Americans were moved to another prison camp at Cabanatuan. At its peak, Cabanatuan held over 8,000 American prisoners. But as the war progressed, the Japanese systematically reduced that number, shipping men to slave labor camps in Japan, Formosa, and Manchuria aboard what prisoners called hell ships. Thousands were crammed into cargo holds with no ventilation, no sanitation, and virtually no food or water. Men suffocated to death standing up. The unmarked ships were attacked by American submarines and aircraft that had no way of knowing they carried Allied prisoners. By January 1945, only 513 prisoners remained at Cabanatuan, those too sick, too weak, or too damaged to be shipped elsewhere. They were the walking dead, ghost soldiers forgotten by the world they'd fought to defend. The Palawan Massacre. On December 14, 1944, the Japanese revealed what they intended for prisoners as American forces approached. At the Palawan prison camp, 150 American POWs were herded into air raid shelters. Japanese soldiers poured gasoline into the trenches and threw in lit torches. As prisoners screamed and burned alive, machine gunners shot anyone who tried to escape the flames. Only 11 men survived, escaping by feigning death or diving off cliffs into the bay. Those survivors brought word to American intelligence. The Japanese were implementing a kill-all policy for prisoners of war rather than allow them to be liberated. The prisoners at Cabanatuan, facing brutal conditions, including disease, torture, and malnourishment, feared they would be executed by their captors before the arrival of General Douglas MacArthur and his American forces returning to Luzon. Major Robert Lapham, leader of Filipino guerrilla forces operating behind Japanese lines, understood the urgency. These men had survived 3 years of hell, the Bataan Death March, the death camps, starvation, disease, and torture. They had endured when endurance seemed impossible. They could not be allowed to die now, murdered in their prison cages as liberation approached. He proposed to Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's intelligence chief, Colonel Horton White, that a rescue attempt be made to liberate the estimated 500 POWs at the Cabanatuan prison camp before the Japanese possibly killed them all. The intelligence was grim. Lapham estimated Japanese forces to include 100 to 300 soldiers within the camp, 1,000 across the Kabu River northeast of the camp, and possibly around 5,000 within Cabanatuan. Any rescue force would be vastly outnumbered, miles behind enemy lines, with no support and limited time. White estimated that the I Corps would not reach Cabanatuan until January 31 or February 1, and that if any rescue attempt were to be made, it would have to be on January 29. Waiting for conventional forces meant arriving to find only corpses. White reported the details to Kruger, who gave the order for the rescue attempt. The mission would require everything special operations could offer: stealth, speed, precision, and extraordinary courage. The Rangers. White gathered Lieutenant Col Henry Mucci, leader of the 6th Ranger Battalion, for a briefing on what would become the defining mission of his career. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci was a Massachusetts native, 33 years old, who had transformed the 6th Ranger Battalion into one of the Pacific Theater's elite units. His men had trained in reconnaissance, raids, and unconventional warfare. They were volunteers selected for physical endurance, mental toughness, and unwavering determination. But they had never attempted anything like this. Mucci gathered his officers and laid out the mission with characteristic bluntness. "We're going 30 miles behind enemy lines to rescue 500 dying men from a fortified prison camp defended by 8,000 Japanese soldiers. We'll be outnumbered at least 10 to 1, probably more. We'll have no artillery support, no air support beyond a distraction, and no backup if things go wrong. The mission is voluntary. Anyone who wants out can leave now with no questions asked. Not a single man moved. Mucci had 120 Rangers from Company C and Company F. He selected Captain Robert Prince with 90 Rangers to lead the assault element. The support element of 30 Rangers would be led by Lieutenant John Murphy. Captain Robert Prince, 27, had graduated from Stanford University and joined the Army in 1941. He was methodical, unflappable, and possessed the rare ability to remain calm when chaos erupted. He would need all those qualities and more. The third critical element came from the Alamo Scouts, 14 men in all from the 6th Army's elite reconnaissance unit. These were the best jungle operators in the Pacific, specialists in moving unseen through enemy territory, gathering intelligence, and surviving where conventional units couldn't operate. Lieutenant William Nellis confirmed the mission. His team and Lieutenant Thomas Stud Roundsvilles were going 25 miles inside Jap lines to rescue 500 GIs held at the Cabanatuan POW camp. Never before had US soldiers been called upon to rescue such a large number of POWs from so deep inside enemy territory. The final element was absolutely essential. The Rangers were bolstered with 200 Filipino guerrillas under the command of CPT Juan Pajota, who would serve as guides and support the assault. Captain Juan Pajota commanded Squadron 201 of the Filipino resistance. His men knew every trail, every village, every Japanese position between American lines and Cabanatuan. They had been fighting the occupation for 3 years, gathering intelligence, conducting sabotage, and keeping hope alive among the Filipino people. Without Pajota's guerrillas, the mission would be impossible. With them, it was merely suicidal. The infiltration. On January 28, 1945, the combined force assembled at Guimba, the last position under American control. Everything beyond was what soldiers called Indian country, enemy-held territory where every step risked detection and death. At 2100 hours, 13 scouts and about 50 of Major Lapham's partisans set out under a half-moon to establish advanced surveillance on the prison camp. The Alamo Scouts moved like ghosts through enemy-occupied villages. Along the route, other guerrillas in the villages muzzled dogs and put chickens in cages lest they alert the Japanese. Every sound could mean discovery. Every light could signal Japanese patrols. The scouts traveled on foot, avoiding roads, moving through rice paddies and jungle trails known only to locals. Behind them came the main force. Over 100 Rangers and Scouts and 200 guerrillas traveled 30 miles behind Japanese lines to reach the camp. They moved at night, hiding during daylight hours, avoiding any contact that might compromise the mission. The march tested every man. The Rangers carried full combat loads, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, rations. The tropical heat was oppressive, the terrain brutal, but they pushed on, knowing that 500 American lives depended on reaching the objective undetected. On January 29, the Scouts reached positions near the camp and began detailed reconnaissance. What they discovered nearly derailed the entire operation. A Jap division was moving past all night until it shut down at dawn to hide out from planes during the day, Nellis informed Colonel Mucci. Our bacon will be out for frying if we collide with those bastards. An entire Japanese division, potentially 12,000 troops, was moving through the area, using daylight hours to hide from American aircraft. The timing couldn't have been worse. Any assault during their movement would result in the Rangers being surrounded and annihilated. Mucci made the agonizing decision to delay 24 hours. The risk was enormous. Intelligence suggested the Japanese might execute the prisoners at any moment, but attacking into a Japanese division guaranteed failure and the deaths of both rescuers and prisoners. The Rangers spent January 29 hiding in Filipino villages, waiting with excruciating patience while men they'd come to save remained in mortal danger a mile away. Lieutenant Bill Nellis closed the distance to within a few hundred yards from the camp to report accurate, timely findings. There was an abandoned shack with a vantage point that could be used to hide in plain sight. Nellist and Rufo Vacular, a Filipino-American, disguised themselves as Filipino farmers, adding straw hats to hide their faces. They strolled into the shack with ease. They could see right into the POW camp, and for 2 hours straight they detailed every square inch of the camp. The intelligence Nellist gathered was precise and invaluable. Guard tower positions, sentry locations, building layouts, the exact position of prisoner barracks, and critically, the location of Japanese tanks that could cut the rescue force to pieces if not neutralized immediately. The assault plan. On January 30, Captain Prince finalized the assault plan based on the Scouts' intelligence. The operation required split-second timing and perfect coordination across multiple elements. Any failure in any component would result in disaster. Japanese reinforcements would arrive before the evacuation completed, trapping rangers and prisoners alike. Pahota's men set up a roadblock on a bridge spanning the Kabu River to stop Japanese reinforcements from reaching the camp. This was perhaps the most critical and dangerous assignment. When the shooting started, approximately 1,000 Japanese troops would attempt to cross that bridge. Pahota's 90 guerrillas would have to hold them, outnumbered more than 10 to 1, long enough for the rescue to succeed. Likewise, LTC Muchi directed CPT Joseon to take his 75 guerrillas and set up another roadblock about 800 yards south of the main gate. He was to block any Japanese attempting to reinforce from the south and west. To meet the enemy's armor threat, Prince attached a 6-man bazooka team. The plan was to set up around the camp, put fire on the Japanese guards and eliminate them, rescue the prisoners and get them all back to friendly lines. The assault was to be led by Captain Robert Prince with 90 Rangers. But one problem remained unsolved. The final approach to the camp crossed 800 yards of open ground, rice paddies offering no concealment whatsoever. In daylight, Japanese sentries would spot the assault force before it covered half the distance. Muchi set the time of attack for 1945 hours, 15 minutes before dark, a compromise between having enough light to coordinate the complex assault and enough approaching darkness to provide some concealment during the final approach. Even that wasn't enough. Captain Pahota had noticed that when U.S. aircraft overflew the prison, that the captors became transfixed and watched the sky even after the planes had passed. The solution was elegantly simple. A P-61 Black Widow night fighter would perform low-altitude aerobatics directly over the camp at the moment of assault. Every Japanese eye would look skyward just as the Rangers made their final rush. Prince kept one squad from 1st Platoon, C Company, as a reserve with him. When all was prepared, Muchi told everyone, "Remember, all of the prisoners go. No one is left behind." The rescue. January 30, 1945, 19:30 hours. The assault force moved into final positions as daylight faded. Rangers crawled through rice paddies, inching forward, every movement carefully controlled to avoid alerting sentries. The prisoners were 800 yards away, unaware that liberation approached. At 19:40 hours, right on schedule, the P-61 Black Widow appeared over the camp, engines roaring. The pilot put the aircraft through aggressive maneuvers, rolls, dives, climbs, creating spectacular aerial theater designed to rivet every Japanese guard's attention skyward. At 19:40 hours, Murphy's men put devastating fire on the Japanese positions, and within 15 seconds had neutralized every guard tower and pillbox. One Ranger blew the lock of the gate with a .45 pistol. The Rangers at the main gate shifted fire towards the Japanese guard barracks and the officers' quarters. Bazooka teams targeted a shed that was thought to have tanks. The synchronization was perfect. Murphy's support element opened fire at the exact moment the P-61 reached its lowest pass. The Japanese, focused on the aircraft, never saw the muzzle flashes until bullets were already impacting. The guard towers, each holding multiple sentries with machine guns that could have massacred the assault force, were neutralized in seconds. Rangers with Thompson submachine guns and Browning automatic rifles poured fire into the wooden structures. Sentries fell before they could return fire or sound alarms. Prince's assault element hit the main gate simultaneously. The lock exploded under .45 caliber fire. Rangers flooded through the opening, weapons ready, moving with the aggressive precision of countless training hours. Japanese soldiers attempting to flee in 2 trucks were targeted and eliminated. The bazooka teams fired into the suspected tank shed, ensuring no armor could engage the rescue force. The Japanese guard barracks erupted in flames as Rangers poured concentrated fire through windows and doors. The entire initial assault lasted less than 30 seconds. In that half-minute, the Rangers had seized control of the camp perimeter, neutralized guard positions, and created a secure corridor for evacuating prisoners. But now came the most unpredictable element: the prisoners themselves. Prince's Rangers rushed the compound, where the prisoners, fearing that the raid was a Japanese ruse to lure them out to be killed, were hiding from their American rescuers. The prisoners had survived 3 years of Japanese brutality through paranoia and suspicion. Many were delirious from malnutrition and disease. Some thought the attack was Japanese guards staging a massacre. Others believed they were hallucinating. Rangers burst into barracks shouting, "We're Americans! We're here to take you home." Some prisoners stared in disbelief. Others wept. Several fainted from shock. Private First Class Franklin Fox Rowe, one of the assault rangers, later described the scene. "They looked like walking skeletons. I thought I was prepared, but nothing prepares you for seeing what they'd become." Guys who probably weighed 180 pounds before the war now weighed 90. You could count every rib, every bone. Their eyes were huge in their skulls, and they couldn't believe we were real. One guy grabbed my sleeve and said, "Don't be a dream. Please don't be a dream." But eventually, the prisoners, led by the Rangers, made their way to the main gate. Many had to be carried due to their weakened condition. The Rangers had trained for combat, but they hadn't trained for this: physically carrying skeletal men who could barely walk, men who weighed so little that the Rangers could carry 2 men on their backs. Outside the camp, the battle intensified. Japanese reinforcements were arriving exactly as intelligence had predicted. Pachota's guerrillas at the Kabu River Bridge were engaged in a desperate fight, holding off hundreds of Japanese soldiers trying to cross. The sounds of battle echoed across the camp: rifle fire, explosions, screams. The Rangers worked frantically to evacuate every prisoner while maintaining security against counterattacks. The 30-minute coordinated attack killed hundreds of Japanese troops. The Americans suffered minimal casualties, but minimal was not zero. The Ranger killed during the raid was Sweezy, who was struck in the back by 2 rounds from friendly fire. In the chaos of night combat, tragic mistakes happened. Private Edwin Rose was also killed during the assault. 20 of Pachota's guerrillas were injured, as were 2 scouts and 2 rangers. At 20:30 hours, 50 minutes after the assault began, the last prisoner was evacuated through the main gate. Captain Prince conducted a final check. 513 prisoners accounted for, plus 33 civilians found in the camp. No one left behind. The withdrawal began under covering fire from the guerrilla forces still engaged with Japanese reinforcements. The march home. The Americans reached their lines at Talavera on January 31. In the meantime, the number of carts had swelled from 26 to 102, as many of the prisoners had found it increasingly difficult to walk. The rescue force had prepared 26 caribou carts, traditional wooden carts pulled by water buffalo, to transport the weakest prisoners. It wasn't enough. Most prisoners couldn't walk more than a few hundred yards before collapsing from exhaustion. Villagers along the way contributed more carts because the Americans had little or no clothing and shoes, and it became increasingly difficult for them to walk. Filipino civilians emerged from their homes, seeing skeletal American soldiers who had defended their country being carried to freedom. They gave what little they had: carts, food, water, encouragement. After crossing the Talavera River, the column ground to a halt. The rescued POWs were exhausted. Just 7 miles from friendly lines, LTC Muchi established security and radioed headquarters for transportation. After a brief discussion, COL White dispatched trucks and ambulances to the river to transport them back to Guimba. There, the rescued were met by LTG Kruger, who remarked, "Most of them were in pitiable condition and could not realize they were actually safe." Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army, had authorized the mission despite its extreme risks. Now he stood watching the fruits of that decision. 513 men who would have died within days now had a chance to live. Medical personnel immediately began emergency treatment. Many prisoners required immediate hospitalization. Some would spend months recovering. Several would never fully recover from the damage done by 3 years of starvation, disease, and brutality. But they were alive, they were free, they were home. The statistics of survival. The raid freed 489 POWs and 33 civilians. The difference between the 513 in camp and 489 POWs reflected the civilians found there, not casualties during the rescue. The Americans suffered minimal casualties. 2 Rangers killed, 2 wounded. 20 of Pachota's guerrillas were injured holding the critical bridge against overwhelming Japanese forces. On the Japanese side, the combined force of Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Philippine guerrillas freed 516 Allied prisoners and killed at least 530 Japanese soldiers. News of the rescue was released to the public on February 2. America, which had endured years of defeats and setbacks in the Pacific, celebrated an unambiguous victory, proof that American soldiers would go to any lengths to save their brothers. On February 11, 1945, 280 POWs left later aboard the transport USS General A.E. Anderson, bound for San Francisco via Hollandia, New Guinea. The ship safely arrived in San Francisco Bay on March 8, 1945. The prisoners brought with them stories that shocked America, first-hand accounts of the Bataan Death March, the death camps, the systematic brutality. For 3 years, rumors had circulated about Japanese treatment of prisoners. Now survivors provided proof. Their testimony galvanized American public opinion, hardening resolve to see the Pacific War through to unconditional Japanese surrender. The men of Cabanatuan became living evidence of why the war had to be fought and won. The recognition. MacArthur spoke about his reaction to the raid. "No incident of the campaign in the Pacific has given me such satisfaction as the release of the POWs at Cabanatuan. The mission was brilliantly successful." He presented awards to the soldiers who participated in the raid on March 3, 1945. Although Mucci was nominated for the Medal of Honor, he and Prince both received Distinguished Service Crosses, the nation's second highest award for valor. Mucci was promoted to colonel and was given command of the 1st Regiment of the 6th Infantry Division. All the other officers and several Rangers received Silver Stars. The rest of the force received Bronze Stars. The 14 Alamo Scouts received Presidential Unit citations. But the greatest recognition came from the men they saved. Every prisoner understood they were alive, because 121 Rangers and Scouts and 200 Filipino guerrillas had risked everything, had traveled 30 miles behind enemy lines, outnumbered 10 to 1, to bring them home. Master Sergeant Charles Bossard, one of the rescued prisoners, later said, "We'd given up. We thought America had forgotten us, left us to die in that camp. Then these Rangers appeared like ghosts, and suddenly we had hope again. They didn't just save our lives, they gave us back our dignity. They proved we weren't forgotten. That mattered more than I can ever explain." The legacy. A 6th Army report indicated that the raid demonstrated what patrols can accomplish in enemy territory by following the basic principles of scouting and patrolling, sneaking and peeping, the use of concealment, reconnaissance of routes from photographs and maps prior to the actual operation, and the coordination of all arms in the accomplishment of a mission. The Cabanatuan raid became a textbook example of special operations, proof that careful planning, precise intelligence, coordinated execution, and extraordinary courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The raid was one of the most successful POW rescue attempts in U.S. military history. It serves as a beacon to the Special Operation Forces of today. Modern Rangers study the Cabanatuan raid as a defining moment in their history. The mission embodied everything the Ranger Creed represents. Never shall I fail my comrades. Energetically will I meet the enemies of my country. Readily will I display the intestinal fortitude required to fight on to the Ranger objective and complete the mission, though I be the lone survivor. The raid also validated the critical role of local partnerships. Without Captain Pachota's Filipino guerrillas, the mission would have failed. Their knowledge of terrain, intelligence on Japanese positions, and willingness to hold off overwhelming reinforcements made success possible. U.S. Army Special Operations legend Arthur Bull Simons served with the 6th Ranger Battalion from 1943 to the unit's decommissioning in 1945. He earned the Silver Star for his role in the Cabanatuan raid. Fast forward to 1970, when Simons was a colonel serving in Vietnam with Mac VSOG, he led the Sun Tay raid, another daring POW rescue deep in North Vietnam. The lessons of Cabanatuan shaped that operation and every American Special Operations mission since. In January 2025, participants in the return to the Cabanatuan prison camp recreated the 1945 crossing of the Pampanga River in the Philippines. Retired Rangers retraced the infiltration route, honoring the men who had walked it 80 years earlier. Paul O'Connell, son of Cabanatuan rescuer Lieutenant William O'Connell, shared that he did not know that his father was part of the raid at Cabanatuan until after his father's death. Like so many who performed extraordinary acts, the Rangers rarely spoke of what they'd done. The mission was enough. The men they saved were reward enough. Epilogue. The Promise Kept. In 1942, when General Douglas MacArthur evacuated from the Philippines to Australia, he made a famous promise: "I shall return." 3 years later, he kept that promise, not just by invading Luzon, but by ensuring that no American would be abandoned. The Cabanatuan raid proved that promise wasn't empty rhetoric. It was an unbreakable commitment. No matter how far behind enemy lines, no matter how dangerous the mission, no matter the odds, American forces would come for their own. The 513 men rescued from Cabanatuan had survived the unsurvivable. They had endured the Bataan Death March, watched comrades die by the thousands, suffered starvation and disease that killed 2/3 of all prisoners. They had been forgotten by everyone except the men who refused to forget. The raid at Cabanatuan wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a declaration. It said to the world, and especially to the enemy, that no one would be left behind. That declaration echoes through every subsequent American Special Operations mission. It inspired the Sun Tay raid in Vietnam. It guided Delta Force operations in Iraq. It drove the search for Bo Bergdahl in Afghanistan. It defines the ethos of every Ranger, every Special Forces operator, every service member who wears the uniform. The men of the 6th Ranger Battalion, the Alamo Scouts, and Captain Pachota's Filipino guerrillas demonstrated what's possible when courage meets determination, when training meets opportunity, when soldiers refuse to accept that any mission is impossible. They traveled 30 miles behind enemy lines. They faced 8,000 enemy soldiers. They assaulted a fortified prison camp. They evacuated 513 dying men through enemy territory. They brought everyone home. Every single one. That's the legacy of Cabanatuan. That's the promise Special Operations keeps. That's what it means to be a Ranger. On the memorial at the Cabanatuan prison camp site, now a Philippine national shrine, stands an inscription that captures the raid's meaning. Here, American Rangers and Filipino guerrillas demonstrated that no prisoner would be abandoned, no comrade forgotten, no distance too far, and no odds too great. They came through the darkness and brought light. They faced death and delivered life. They are the standard by which all rescues are measured. The survivors' stories. The men rescued from Cabanatuan carried their experience for the rest of their lives. Some spoke freely about their ordeal, others never mentioned it. The memory is too painful to revisit. Private First Class Bert Bank, rescued from Cabanatuan, returned home to Texas weighing 89 pounds, less than half his pre-war weight. He spent 6 months in military hospitals regaining strength. His family barely recognized him. My mother cried when she saw me, Bank later recalled. Not tears of joy, tears of horror at what they'd done to her son. It took years before I could eat a full meal without getting sick. My body had forgotten how to process normal food. Many survivors struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares plagued them, loud noises triggered panic attacks. They couldn't bear to see food wasted. Having watched men die of starvation, throwing away even a crust of bread felt like sacrilege. Captain Ed Dias, who had escaped from a different prison camp and made it back to Allied lines, provided early testimony about Japanese atrocities. His account of the Bataan Death March, published in January 1944, shocked America and galvanized support for the Pacific War. Dias died in a training accident before the Cabanatuan raid, but his testimony helped ensure that rescue operations became a priority. The Cabanatuan survivors formed an association, meeting annually to commemorate their rescue and honor the Rangers who saved them. At these reunions, skeletal old men who had been skeletal young men embraced the aging Rangers who had carried them to freedom. At the 50th anniversary reunion in 1995, former prisoner Ralph Rodriguez stood to address the assembled Rangers. You gave us back our lives, but more than that, you gave us back our faith in humanity. After 3 years of brutality, of watching the worst of what humans can do to each other, we'd forgotten that courage and compassion existed. Then you appeared. You risked everything for men you'd never met. You taught us that honor still existed in the world. We've spent 50 years trying to live up to the gift you gave us. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The Rangers' burden. The Rangers who conducted the raid rarely spoke of it as heroic. They saw it as duty, what soldiers do for other soldiers. Captain Robert Prince returned to civilian life and became an architect in San Francisco. He designed buildings, raised a family, and lived quietly. When asked about Cabanatuan, he deflected attention. We did our jobs. The real heroes were the prisoners who survived 3 years of hell. We were just there for one night. But Prince's nightmares told a different story. He dreamed of the skeletal faces, the men too weak to walk, the ones they'd carried. He dreamed of the Japanese reinforcements arriving sooner, of failing to evacuate everyone, of having to leave men behind. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci carried a different burden. As commander, every decision rested on his shoulders. The 24-hour delay on January 29, waiting for the Japanese division to pass, haunted him. What if they'd executed the prisoners during those 24 hours? He asked in a 1985 interview. What if my caution cost lives? That's the weight of command. You make the best decision you can with the information available, but you never know if it was the right decision. The men of Cabanatuan stayed in touch throughout their lives, bound by shared experience that outsiders could never fully understand. They had gone to hell together, fought together, and survived together. That creates bonds that time cannot break. When Captain Juan Pachota died in 1976, Rangers from the Cabanatuan raid traveled to the Philippines for his funeral. They carried his coffin, these aging American warriors, honoring the Filipino guerrilla leader whose courage had made their mission possible. We couldn't have done it without Juan, Prince said at the funeral. He held that bridge against impossible odds. He and his men saved us all. The Japanese perspective. Understanding the Cabanatuan raid requires acknowledging the Japanese perspective, however difficult that examination may be. The Japanese soldiers guarding Cabanatuan were following orders within a military culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. In their worldview, the American and Filipino prisoners had dishonored themselves by surrendering rather than fighting to death. This cultural context doesn't excuse the brutality, nothing excuses it, but it helps explain the systematic cruelty. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese officers revealed that the guards at Cabanatuan knew the war was lost by January 1945. American forces had retaken the Philippines. Japan's navy was shattered. Defeat was inevitable. Yet they continued following orders, even orders that demanded atrocities. Some Japanese soldiers expressed regret decades later. Others defended their actions or remained silent. The Tokyo war crimes trials prosecuted some commanders responsible for POW atrocities. Many guards escaped justice entirely. The kill-all policy that led to the Palawan massacre and threatened the Cabanatuan prisoners represented a final spasm of brutality from a defeated empire. Rather than allow prisoners to testify about their treatment, Japanese authorities ordered their elimination. It was systematic, premeditated murder on a massive scale. The Cabanatuan raid prevented that massacre. The 513 men rescued would have been dead within days, executed to prevent them from becoming witnesses. The Rangers didn't just rescue dying men, they rescued living evidence of war crimes. The Filipino resistance. The Cabanatuan raid couldn't have succeeded without the Filipino guerrillas who risked everything to resist Japanese occupation. Captain Juan Pachota's men had been fighting for 3 years when the Rangers arrived. They had conducted sabotage operations, gathered intelligence, protected civilians, and maintained resistance networks across Japanese-occupied territory. They did this knowing that capture meant torture and execution, that Japanese forces would burn villages suspected of harboring guerrillas, that their families would suffer if their activities were discovered. Yet they persevered, motivated by love of country and hatred of occupation. The guerrillas provided critical intelligence for the Cabanatuan raid. They knew Japanese positions, patrol patterns, reinforcement capabilities. They guided the Rangers through enemy territory. They blocked roads to prevent reinforcements. They held the Cabu River Bridge against overwhelming odds. 20 guerrillas were wounded in the operation. Their names deserve remembering. Eduardo Joson, Juan Pachota, and their men who fought, knowing they'd receive less recognition than their American counterparts, but fought anyway because it was right. After the war, many Filipino guerrilla fighters received minimal recognition. Some were denied benefits given to conventional forces. Others struggled to prove their service. The partnership that made Cabanatuan possible was often forgotten in post-war narratives that emphasized American heroism while minimizing Filipino contributions. Modern commemorations have worked to correct this imbalance. At the Cabanatuan Memorial, Filipino and American flags fly side by side. The plaques honor both nations' soldiers equally. Annual ceremonies ensure that new generations understand this was a joint operation, a partnership, a shared triumph. Captain Pachota's grandson, speaking at the 70th anniversary in 2015, captured the essence of that partnership. My grandfather never sought glory. He fought for his country and for the American soldiers who had defended it. When the Rangers needed help, he didn't hesitate. That's the Filipino-American alliance in its purest form. Brothers in arms, fighting for shared values, willing to die for each other. That alliance still matters today. The modern legacy. The Cabanatuan raid influences modern special operations doctrine in multiple ways. First, it validated deep penetration raids behind enemy lines. Military planners had questioned whether such operations were feasible or worthwhile. Cabanatuan proved that carefully planned, precisely executed raids could achieve strategic objectives that conventional operations couldn't match. Second, it demonstrated the critical importance of intelligence. The Alamo Scouts' reconnaissance provided the detailed information that made success possible. Modern special operations devote enormous resources to intelligence gathering precisely because of lessons learned at Cabanatuan. Third, it showcased the value of indigenous partnerships. The Filipino guerrillas weren't auxiliaries or support elements, they were essential partners whose local knowledge and combat skills made the mission viable. Today's special operations forces prioritize building partnerships with local forces, understanding that outsiders can never know terrain, culture, and enemy as well as locals do. Fourth, the raid illustrated that success in special operations requires accepting risk. Muche faced criticism for delaying the assault when Japanese forces moved through the area. A more risk-averse commander might have aborted entirely. Muche balanced caution with determination, accepting calculated risks to achieve the mission. The 75th Ranger Regiment, direct descendant of the 6th Ranger Battalion, studies Cabanatuan as a foundational operation. Every ranger learns the story during training. Many can recite the timeline, the force composition, the obstacles overcome. It's part of Ranger DNA. When Delta Force operators trained for the Sante raid in 1970, they studied Cabanatuan extensively. When SEAL Team 6 planned the Bin Laden raid in 2011, they analyzed historical deep penetration operations, including Cabanatuan. The lessons endure because the fundamentals remain constant: intelligence, planning, rehearsal, execution, courage. The unanswered questions. Despite extensive documentation, some aspects of the Cabanatuan raid remain mysterious or contested. The exact number of Japanese casualties varies by source. Some accounts claim 523 killed. Others report higher or lower figures. The chaos of night combat, combined with guerrilla actions separate from the main assault, makes precise accounting impossible. The fate of some Japanese guards remains unknown. Did some escape? Were some killed by civilians seeking revenge? The historical record contains gaps that will never be filled. Questions persist about intelligence failures as well. Why didn't American forces know about the Japanese division moving through the area until the scouts reported it? How did such a large formation move undetected? These questions reveal limitations in intelligence capabilities that could have doomed the mission. Some controversy exists about recognition and awards. Why did Mucci receive a Distinguished Service Cross instead of the Medal of Honor for which he was nominated? Why did some participants receive Bronze Stars while others received Silver Stars for similar actions? These questions reflect the imperfect nature of military award systems, where bureaucracy and politics sometimes influence decisions that should be purely about valor. The most poignant unanswered question concerns the prisoners who didn't survive to be rescued. Over 7,500 Americans passed through Cabanatuan between 1942 and 1945. Only 513 remained when the Rangers arrived. What happened to the others? Some were shipped to labor camps and survived the war. Many died of disease, starvation, or brutality. Some were aboard hell ships sunk by American submarines. Their fates remain largely unknown, their stories untold. The final reunion. In January 2015, the 70th anniversary of the raid, fewer than a dozen survivors, both rescued prisoners and Rangers, remained alive to attend the commemoration in the Philippines. They were in their 90s, frail, using wheelchairs and walkers, but they made the journey one final time to the place where their lives had intersected 7 decades earlier. Former prisoner Bert Bank, now 93, stood at the memorial and addressed the crowd. 70 years ago, I was dying in this place. I weighed 89 pounds. I couldn't walk without help. I had given up hope. Then these Rangers appeared, and everything changed. They gave me back my life. I've had 70 years I wouldn't have had, a wife, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. All of it exists because these men refused to leave us behind. Former Ranger Robert Prince, 95 years old, replied simply, "We just did our jobs. You're the ones who survived the unsurvivable. You're the real heroes." The two men, rescuer and rescued, embraced, crying freely, bound by an experience that had defined both their lives. That scene captures the Cabanatuan raid's ultimate meaning. It wasn't about tactics or strategy or military doctrine. It was about soldiers refusing to abandon soldiers. It was about believing that every life matters, that no one is expendable, that brothers come home together or not at all. The 2015 reunion was likely the last time survivors gathered in significant numbers. Age and mortality are the final enemies that no amount of courage can defeat. Soon, all who participated in the raid will have passed, leaving only the historical record and the legacy. But that legacy endures. It lives in every special operations mission. It lives in the Ranger Creed. It lives in the commitment that no American service member will be left behind, no matter the cost. Conclusion.